The House Transportation, Mobility, and Infrastructure Committee will come to order. Would the clerk please take attendance?
Chair Shannon.
Present.
Representatives McDonald,
Present.
Coleman,
Here.
Conlon,
Present.
Farhat,
Present.
Fitzgerald,
Present.
Hoskins,
Here.
Miller, here, Outman,
Here.
Roth,
Here.
Bruck, Kuntz,
Here.
St. Germain.
Present remote. That was Brooke.
Mr. Chair, you have 13 members present. You do have a quorum.
Thank you. I need a motion to adopt minutes from last week, March 7th. Representative Farhat makes that motion. Seeing no opposition, the minutes are adopted. So continuing our presentations, today is William Hamilton from House Fiscal Agency to discuss the transportation budget. Thank you so much for coming in today and giving us some of your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is William Hamilton. I am a senior fiscal analyst at the House Fiscal Agency, and I'm here today to talk about transportation funding in Michigan. We're going to talk about state resources that are distributed for state and local transportation programs, and the key word for state resources is distributed. We're also going to talk about federal funds that are made available for state and local transportation programs. And for federal programs, the key word is made available. So if you're keeping notes, those are the two distinctions to start with. So we're going to talk about these resources, state resources, federal resources, and our starting point is going to be the state transportation budget. We're going to talk about the programs the budget supports, the transportation programs supported by the budget. Then we're going to talk about the revenue sources that support the budget. And then we're going to step back from the budget and talk about actual revenue, actual history, and some issues with transportation funding in Michigan. Because the budget, it's a good starting point, it's a good way to understand transportation funding, but it's limited because it's 1 year. We're just looking at 1 year, and the budget is based on budget estimates. You want to step back and look at the actual history over a long period. And actually, we're going to step back and look back for 25 years to get a good perspective. So that's our starting point. And we're going to begin with the current year transportation budget, the fiscal year that we're in today that would end September 30th, 2023. So if you want to give the talk a snappy name, it's the transportation budget and beyond. So I think the presentation will take about 45 minutes, and I'll have time for questions. At the leave of the chair, I don't mind if you interrupt me with questions. That's fine, too. So let's start. So let me look. So basically, the starting point, the state transportation budget supports state and local road and bridge programs, including construction and preservation of the state trunk line system, funding for local road systems, 83 county road commissions, 531 cities and villages, capital and operating supports for 78 public transit agencies, capital and operating assistance for rail passenger service in Michigan, and capital assistance for local airports in Michigan, and also administration of the Michigan Department of Transportation. And we're going to skip through some of the slides. They're too detailed. They're not actually great PowerPoint slides, but you should have hard copies. We can follow along on the hard copies if there's too much text. So here's one where you may want to look at the hard copy. This is a snapshot of the current year budget. And it's a table. A lot of the House Fiscal Agency budget documents have a table like this, where so the beginning point in looking at budget documents, gross appropriations. In this case, it's $6,129,448,900. So in large budgets like this, we will typically round up. So from this point forward, this is a $6.1 billion budget. For most budgets, then at the fiscal agency, we look right down at state general fund, general purpose revenue. That's the critically important fund source in most budgets. So in this case, you look all the way down at the bottom. General fund in the current year, $91.2 million. And we'll talk more about general fund in this budget as we go along. But in this budget, the two critical components are state restricted revenue, $3.9 billion, and federal revenue, a little over $2 billion. So the big distinction between general fund and state restricted revenue, which you look in budgets, it's restricted either by the Constitution or by a statute for a particular purpose. It can't be appropriated for other than that restricted purpose. So in this budget, much of the budget is restricted. These restricted funds are restricted in the state constitution. We're talking about motor fuel taxes and registration taxes that are constitutionally restricted for transportation. So again, the beginning point, 6.1 billion, and this is where I stop and just make a little point about billions. Most of us never encounter a billion anything. It's just like an enormous big number. And so one thing that economists do to anchor numbers, is in economics you call it anchoring, it's to refer one number to a different number, even if it's a totally unrelated number. And in my presentations, I just point out that $6 billion is approximately what we spend gambling in the state of Michigan. And we can talk more about that at a different time, but that kind of anchors the number in your head, if you'd like, 6.1 billion. A billion is 1,000 million, but you know that. That's another point. So here, looking at this, again, staying at this table, approximately 2/3 of this budget is state-restricted funds and about 1/3 from federal resources. Here is the same table in a pie chart, and this jumps out at you. State-restricted funds, 64% of the budget, federal aid, about 1/3 of the budget, and this year, general fund is about 1% of the budget, and that fluctuates from year to year. The general fund is the one big variable, and again, we'll talk about that later. This is state transportation as a share of the total budget. I'm going to skip through this because, again, it's too detailed. Here is a bar chart showing transportation appropriations going back to 2005. And you can see the bottom part of the bar, state restricted funds. Again, typically about 1/3 of the budget. The green part of the bar, federal funds, again, typically about 1/3 of the budget. You see in 2009 a big spike in federal aid. That is from federal stimulus funds. During the Great Recession, the federal government provided all states additional federal funds in transportation. And again, looking at the last 2 or 3 years, there's a spike in appropriated revenue. This reflects two things: the 2015 road funding package and increases in federal aid to all states. So that's, again, these are appropriations budgets. So again, now we're going to talk about the appropriation areas: road and bridge programs, public transportation programs, and aeronautics programs in the budget. So again, another pie chart. So the big blue slice of the pie are road and bridge programs, broadly understood. So of the $6.1 billion budget, almost $5.2 billion, 84% are for road and bridge programs. And again, we'll talk about these in more detail. About 11%, $653.8 million for public transportation programs, $301.4 million for aeronautics programs. Again, this is the pie chart. The next chart is way too busy for the projection. You can see it on your slides, but this is a more detailed breakup of that pie chart. So we're going to talk about transportation revenue. This is the appropriation chart once again. The last time I showed it, it was a bar chart. This is an area chart, and this goes back a little further to 1997. So again, the lower blue part of the graph or the chart, state restricted funds, the green part, federal funds, and some smaller parts, general fund and additional revenue up at the top. Again, you look at 2009, there's a big spike when the federal government provided additional aid to states, including Michigan. And again, on the far end of this graph, you see increases from the 2015 road funding package and additional federal aid. So again, this is a 25-year picture, and again, this is just looking at the budget, the appropriation. And wait, I'm going to back up. So if you look at 2023, the current fiscal year, you see the breakdown of state restricted, the biggest share, federal funds. The next slide, this is a pie chart simply showing the state restricted part of this budget. So in 2023, state restricted revenue totaled $3.9 billion. And that is made up of the following components. You see up at the top left, the gasoline share of motor fuel taxes. Sometimes people just talk about it as the gas tax. That equates to about $1.2 billion. And look below that, vehicle registration taxes. That equates to about $1.5 billion. Vehicle registration taxes actually make up a bigger share of dedicated transportation revenue than the gas tax. We all focus on the gas tax and challenges about the gas tax. Vehicle registrations make up the biggest share of this pie, and they have for quite a while. I'd say at least maybe 10 years. Registration taxes are the biggest share. And then one thing on the upper right-hand column, this is a fairly new addition to state restricted funds, the income tax earmark. The current fiscal year includes $600 million of an earmark from the state income tax, and that again was part of the November 2015 road funding package. And then finally, the dark area, I guess I should have a pointer, but here we go. The dark area, diesel fuel taxes, $257.5 million. That's actually a fairly small part of this pie. So the motor fuel taxes, vehicle registration taxes, the diesel motor fuel taxes are all constitutionally restricted for transportation. This income tax earmark is simply earmarked in statute, the Income Tax Act. And this is a lot of text to project in a PowerPoint slide, but motor fuel taxes, again, it's a per gallon tax for both gasoline and diesel motor fuel. The tax was 19 cents per gallon prior to the November 2015 road funding package. It was 27.2 through December of 2022, and the current tax rate is 28.6 cents per gallon. Vehicle registration taxes, we talk about vehicle registration taxes, but there are actually dozens of registration taxes depending on the type of vehicle, the use of the vehicle, some characteristic of the vehicle owner in some cases. The biggest share are, it's a value-based tax on passenger vehicles, primarily passenger vehicles and light trucks. So if you have a vehicle with a suggested list price of $40,000, the initial 12-year registration tax is going to be approximately $240. It's the proverbial birthday tax. So every year, everyone pays the tax for passenger vehicles based on the value of the vehicle. For certain trucks, heavier trucks, commercial trucks, they pay a weight-based tax. Both those taxes were increased by about 20% with the November 2015 road funding package, although there are some vehicle registration categories that were not increased. There's a whole category, several categories that were not increased. And then finally, the income tax earmark, as we just mentioned, that's currently $600 million a year. It's dedicated for state and local road and bridge programs. It's $600 million in the current year, and it will be $600 million ongoing forever unless the Income Tax Act is amended. Federal revenue, and gosh, again, this is a lot of text, but so these are, the federal government makes federal funds available to states through transportation programs. And again, the critical word here is made available. The state model is mostly a distribution model. Funds are distributed to county road commissions, cities and villages, to the state trunk line fund. In this case, federal aid is available through programs, categorical programs for qualifying projects and activities. So the current Federal Aid Authorizing Act is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's often shorthanded as IJA. You've had testimony about IJA. This is not a one-time program. I think someone suggested it was one time. This is an ongoing federal aid program that the current structure of it dates back to the 1950s. One thing to note about the federal aid program, it historically was funded from the Federal Highway Trust Fund, and that was supported by federal transportation taxes, including an 18.3 cent per gallon gasoline tax and certain commercial truck excise taxes. But in the same thing has happened at the federal level as has happened in the state of Michigan. Those dedicated federal taxes were not enough to sustain these federal program obligations. So the federal government has been adding federal general fund to the Highway Trust Fund. So it is no longer, we think about transportation funds as a user fee model funded with road taxes. That's no longer the case either at the state level or the federal level. And again, we can talk about that in more detail. So one thing about federal aid, again, we're stuck on this very detailed text. So the federal funds are made available to states. In Michigan, a number of local road agencies have roads and streets that are eligible for federal aid. So in Michigan, Act 51 requires that an average of 25% of most federal aid highway funds be sub-allocated to local units, to local jurisdictions. So not every local jurisdiction, again, this is not a distributive program, not every local jurisdiction receives it. It's not like they get a monthly check from the federal government. It's a reimbursement program for eligible projects. And I should also mention the federal aid provides funding for public transportation programs, and the Federal Airport Improvement Program provides capital improvements at public airports. Then again, the one component in the current year, which is a fairly small component, is the direct appropriation of state general fund general purpose revenue. And I did some research on this. It used to be that the transportation budget never included general fund revenue. In fact, you have to go look back to the Great Depression era of the late 1932. There was an appropriation of $5 million general fund in the transportation budget at that time. I wasn't doing the budget at that time, but I read about this, I heard about it. And that situation, and that was a one-time thing. It was discussed in the 1963 Constitutional Convention in Michigan, that it was a one-time thing. So that situation obtained through 2012. General fund had rarely been used in this budget. Then beginning in 2012, general fund revenue was included in transportation appropriations. Since 2012 and through the current fiscal year, over $2 billion in state general fund revenue has been appropriated in this budget. $1.8 billion in direct GFGP appropriations, $230 million from general sources that were described in the budget as state restricted, but were actually general fund. And that doesn't include the $600 million from the income tax that is effectively general fund that's been redirected. Much of this has been distributed to the state trunk line fund and local road and bridge programs in the same way as state restricted funds. The current transportation budget includes $91.2 million. There's a slide that talks about other revenue. I'll skip over this. It's kind of a budget thing. So now we're going to talk in more detail about road and bridge programs. As I mentioned, 84% of this budget is dedicated for road and bridge programs, broadly understood. So of that, 2.7 billion is appropriated for state trunk line programs. Those are programs administered by the Michigan Department of Transportation. And when we talk about trunk lines, we're talking about the interstate highways, the M-numbered highways, the US-numbered highways. So again, in southeast Michigan, you're thinking about I-96, I-94, I-75, US-numbered highways like US 23. It's the big, generally the busiest high-level roads and streets. 24 billion is appropriated or made available to local road agencies, county road commissions, cities and villages. And this distribution between state trunk line programs, between county road commissions to cities and villages, that is governed by a statute, Public Act 51 of 1951. So this slide shows the division between state trunk lines, county roads, cities, and villages. So from the perspective of linear miles, route miles, the state trunk line share of total state mileage is about 8%. County roads represent about 74.4%, and city and village streets about 17.6%. But then if you look at the next measure, vehicle miles traveled. And so the Michigan Department of Transportation measures use of these systems. 51.9% of the vehicle miles traveled are on state trunk lines, 32.2 on county roads, 15.9 on city and village streets. And that makes sense when you think about the mileage and the traffic on interstate highways, for example, especially say in southeast Michigan. Here is another measure, Michigan bridges by jurisdiction. There are about 40% of the structures are on state trunk line highways, 52% on county roads, 7.9 on city and village streets. But the next measure, deck area, this is the size of these bridges. So 73.5% of the deck area is on state trunk lines. And again, this makes sense when you think about the Zilwaukee Bridge, the I-75 bridge over the Rouge River. It's an 8-lane structure carrying across a major river. So in deck area, state trunk lines, 73.5. And then another measure, average daily traffic on these structures, about 83.8% is on the state trunk line system. So this is a snapshot of the system. Again, we've got the three primary jurisdictional levels: trunk lines, county roads, city and village streets. The budget also supports public transportation programs. About 10.7% of the budget is appropriated for public transportation programs. That includes capital and operating assistance to public transit agencies. And that runs the range from big metro systems like DDOT and SMART. In southeast Michigan, we have CATA in the city of Lansing. But even outstate counties have county-wide systems, some systems that are focused more on elderly, disabled population. So the budget funds, again, operating assistance and capital assistance. One thing to note about these agencies, they're all local units of government. The state of Michigan does not own a public transit agency. They all belong to your local communities in some sense. We provide capital and operating assistance for Amtrak rail passenger service and also some targeted public transportation programs. And again, in the same way with the road and bridge programs, these programs are defined and governed by a statute, Public Act 51 of 1951. And again, most of the folks who testify will just talk about Act 51. Then finally, aeronautics programs. almost all of the airports in the state of Michigan, except for a very small handful of I think 5 very small airports, all the airports are local units of government. They're either a division of a county, a municipality, set up as an airport authority, and they all are self-sufficient with respect to operations. The state of Michigan does not provide operating assistance, but it does provide capital assistance for runway maintenance, expansion, terminals, capital assistance. And this is a federal aid program. So the current budget includes $301.4 million for aeronautics programs, and again, most of that is for a federal aid capital assistance program. So there's a quick run through of the 3 big program areas in the budget. So when you look at all of these, and again, I mentioned that much of it is either distributed or made available to local units of government. Road commissions, cities, villages, transit agencies, local airports. And when you assemble it all, this is the classic fiscal agency pie chart. Over half of the appropriations in this budget are either distributed through a distribution model or made available to local units of government. So in this current year, about almost 3.3 million for local programs and 47% for direct state programs under the control and direct administration of the Michigan Department of Transportation. So again, this is a big high-level look at the whole budget. So now we're going to look at one component, and now is where we're going to make the switch from looking at the budget to more looking at actual revenue and revenue history. We talked about restricted funds. The biggest restricted fund source is the Michigan Transportation Fund, the MTF. And some of your witnesses will talk about the MTF. The MTF is the main collection and distribution fund for state transportation revenue from motor fuel taxes and vehicle registration taxes. And since the 2015 road funding package, an earmark of income taxes. So this revenue source was basically flat for at least 15 years. And I've got a chart that'll show that next. Prior to the 2015 road funding package, the last time there had been a baseline increase in dedicated transportation taxes was August 1997. MTF revenue peaked in 2004, and in 2013, MTF revenue is almost identical to what it was 13 years prior. And I'll show this all on the next slide. I'm whetting your interest, your anticipation. And then revenue began to increase in 2017 with the implementation of the November 15-20 road funding package. Some of you may have already skipped ahead in your copies. Here's the chart. So again, if the one data point I used in 1999, MTF revenue was $1,893,000,000. It peaked in 2004, and part of that was kind of a one-time anomaly. The shift in trailer taxes caused a spike in 2004. But then you look forward to 2013, MTF revenue was $1,894,000,000, almost identical to what it was in 1999. So that's, over that period, it's a totally flat trend line. Mr. Chairman, I've got a question at the end, if you don't mind.
That transition was due to going to permanent trailer plates, not trailer taxes.
Well, it's a registration tax on trailer. I mean, I know folks talk about, it's a permanent trailer. Yes,
Plate.
it's a move from an
Right.
annual registration tax to a permanent tax.
Correct, and it moved it forward.
Yep. So again, for that period, you see totally flat MTF revenue. And one thing you need to keep in mind, this is not adjusted for inflation. These are in nominal dollars. So I haven't adjusted, but we all have a sense that the value of money has decreased in some periods more than others. And then finally, you see the jump beginning primarily in January 2017 with the implementation of the road funding package. So that's a little snapshot of recent transportation history, and this is why I think it's important to look at actual revenue over a long period of time to give you a better sense. Oh, one other thing I'll mention about this, and this also speaks to when you have presentations, think about what baseline presenters are using. If we'd used 2017 as the baseline, it would look like an enormous spike in revenue. It's 75% from the 2017 baseline. But that 75% spike has to be looked at in the context of the previous, say, 20 years. So keep that in mind. The next slide, again, this is a bar chart looking at MTF revenue from the different components, fuel taxes, registration taxes. And then at the top, the orange, other state resources. This is the earmark of income tax. And also in recent years, there's an earmark of the tax on recreational marijuana, which I think is about 60 million. It's not a huge amount, but it should be noted. Here is a line chart showing basically the same thing broken out. And then you can see registration taxes. It's the broken line at the top. That's where you can see that registration taxes are now the biggest contributor to MTF revenue. So again, there's a great deal of focus on the gas tax and challenges to the gas tax because it's a declining tax base, but registration taxes are actually the biggest component now of MTF revenue. So now we're going to talk about one measure of the transportation system. And this has to do with pavement condition. And one specific measure, one specific component of pavement. So we're talking, in this point, we're talking about the state trunk line system, the interstate highway system, U.S. highways, M-numbered highways. So in 1997, the State Transportation Commission established a performance measure. It's often shorthanded as 90% of the state trunk line pavement in good and fair condition. And they made a similar performance measure for state line bridges. The Michigan Department of Transportation met that pavement performance goal in 2007 and the performance goal for bridges in 2008. And again, you may be looking ahead to the next slide. They sustained that for a couple years, and then the pavement condition goals declined. And MDOT estimates that it will currently need an additional $2 billion annually just for its system, not including the local road system, to hit that 90% good condition and sustain it, typically for a 10-year perspective. Again, local road agencies have had similar revenue constraints and pavement conditions, but the slide I'm going to show you that you're already looking at is simply of the state trunk line system. So here we are. So you can see that in 2007, the green line is the pavement performance goal, and the blue line is the actual measure. Again, we're looking at actual measures of, they use a measure called RSL, remaining service life for pavement condition. So again, they hit that goal, and then it began to decline. And then the next slide is the Michigan Department of Transportation's estimate of state trunk line, freeway, non-freeway pavement condition going forward. And as you can see, based on their modeling of pavement condition and current available revenue for their system, they project a long-term decline, hitting about 50%, below 50%. Again, a number of components go in this. This can change annually based on actual pavement measures, actual revenue, but this is their most recent estimate. So one thing to keep in mind when looking at presentations of these type of pavement performance measures, It's one measure of one component of the transportation system. This is simply the state trunk line system, and this is simply pavement condition. You have to remember that there are other measures of safety, economic development, mobility, number of measures, but these charts are simply of a measure of one component, pavement condition, and in this case, the trunk line system. So another thing to keep in mind, some of the presenters are measuring different things using different measurement tools. So I've watched some of the testimony, so you'll be looking at, in some cases, these are to somewhat apples and oranges comparisons, measuring different things using different measurement tools. So keep that in mind. Then finally, this is my last slide. So this is just a quick summation of the November 2015 road funding package. It was enacted in November 2015. It increased motor fuel taxes, increased motor fuel taxes and vehicle registration taxes effective January 1st, 2017. So it was a bit over a year. It was past November 2015. It took over a year to become implemented. And it also began the earmarking of, as I mentioned, income taxes. In 2019, $264 million. In 2020, $468 million. And in the 2021, $600 million. And it will be $600 million going forward indefinitely until the Income Tax Act is amended. So those two components, the increases in dedicated transportation taxes, fuel taxes, registration taxes, that added about $222 million, and when fully implemented, the $600 million from income tax. So the total package added up to about $1.2 billion. So again, that's a quick run through of, again, beginning with the budget and then looking back at actual revenue history. And of course, I'm available for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Hamilton. I really appreciate the very thorough presentation today on the transportation budget. A lot of information there. I do have a couple questions, but I will remind members that Mr. Hamilton is here just to give us a presentation on the facts, and he's not here to advocate for either this or that. And so just keep that in mind when asking your question, okay? So I will go with Representative Roth.
Thank you, sir, for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I'm looking at the charts, and I'm seeing a revenue increase considerably on the chart, and then I'm seeing it has a 15, but yet I'm seeing a condition on the roads going down pretty dramatically after 15. And I don't expect you to tell me all the construction part of it, but I'm wondering, is there something in the modeling that you can give us on that?
So again, I don't work for the Michigan Department of Transportation. They develop the models. And I remember very distinctly in 2016, the director at the time of the Michigan Department of Transportation testified, and a member asked a similar question that the legislature just enacted this funding package. Why do they continue to see the pavement decay model decline? And the director said the 2015 road funding package simply slowed the rate of decline. Because someone asked, why isn't that pavement decay chart reversing and going back up? The director said that they actually needed, when they modeled it back in 2011, the Michigan Department of Transportation said that they needed, I'm thinking, about $1 billion annually just for the trunk line program. The 2015 road funding package wasn't fully implemented until 2021, 10 years later, and the Michigan Department of Transportation's share of that, roughly a third or maybe 40% of that additional revenue. So the MDOT would say, we only got a a portion of what we'd asked for 10 years prior. Again, I don't work for the department, but that I
not
think
expecting
I'm
that.
fairly paraphrasing what they would testify to.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Roth. Representative Conlon.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for a very enlightening presentation. You mentioned that Act 51, because of that, 25% of federal and highway funds go to local jurisdictions. And then you said, but they get reimbursed for eligible projects. What is eligible?
So, again, to make the distinction between the distribution of the Michigan Transportation Fund. So, the Michigan Transportation Fund is distributed every month to county road commissions and cities and villages on a formula basis. And the analogy I use, this isn't true, but it's a mental picture. Your county road commission director runs out to the mailbox every month and gets a check. It doesn't happen that way, but that's a good way to think about it. Federal funds are made available for eligible projects and activities, primarily almost exclusively for capital activities, so not maintenance, road construction and reconstruction. So it has to be a capital project, and only roads and streets that meet certain criteria. So federal funds typically aren't used for subdivision streets, very local streets. They have to meet it's called functional classification. They have to meet a certain functional classification. So in Michigan, county road commissions in cities and villages do have jurisdiction over some roads and streets meeting that criteria, much more so than in other states. So state law has determined that approximately 25% on average will be made available to those local jurisdictions for eligible projects. And again, in Southeast Michigan, that whole project development and selection process is administered by the Metropolitan Planning Organization. Actually, that's true in all urbanized areas, but in Southeast Michigan, SEMCOG is the agency, and in Ingham County, Ingham, Eaton, Clinton County belong to a tri-county. So the MPO in your area helps develop projects, make sure that they meet certain criteria. And again, in Michigan, that's not a federal mandate, that is a state law that sub-allocates part of the federal aid to local units.
Any other questions? Seeing no other questions, thank you so. Oh, do I have? Yep. I'm sorry, I didn't. Okay. Yes, Representative St. Germain.
Sorry about that. When you're talking about registration fees, is that just limited to vehicles and trailers, or does that include ORVs, boats, things along that nature?
Just motor vehicles that travel on public highways. So that would include like passenger cars, light trucks, big commercial vehicles, trailers. I think not boats.
Okay.
They've
I was just curious.
motor vehicles.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hamilton, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming in today and giving us this information. So there being no further business before the committee will stand adjourned.